In this video, we're going to talk about compliance. I know it might not sound that exciting, but it's totally necessary, right? That's coming up right now. Hi there, I'm Andrea Adams. This is HR Shop Talk, and a place where you're going to get insight into HR. I encourage you to subscribe to the show or to the podcast to keep learning from my smart and experienced guests. Today, my guest is Gayle Wadden. Gayle is a lawyer and recently launched a platform to help Canadians understand their compliance issues. It's called Compliance Works, and it isn't even that expensive. Mind you, that's besides the point. Today, we're going to talk about compliance in general. Hi, Gayle.
Hi, nice to be here.
Yeah, nice to have you. And I have lots of questions as always. So let's just get started. So speaking of getting started, where should we start this conversation around compliance? It's such a big topic. How do you organize your thoughts?
It's a really good question. I think it's important to understand, first of all, what we're talking about when we say compliance. Compliance is about legislation. So it's about the laws that are passed by our provincial and federal government that impact on HR and the employment relationship. So these include things like employment standards, health and safety, human rights, privacy, pay equity, accessibility, and labor relations.
Right.
And I think when we start talking about this, it's also really important to understand how tough compliance can be. And that's the starting point for me. Laws aren't written in a user-friendly way. They're written by lawyers, for lawyers. They're not written in a way that's intended for, the layperson to understand. On top of that, they change all the time. The law is not static. Those obligations are changing and they vary from one jurisdiction to another. So it's a lot to stay on top of.
So, obviously we should care about compliance because, that could get us in trouble, but are there some less obvious reasons we should be caring?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of reasons to care about compliance, actually. And you're right, there's obvious reasons and there are sort of less obvious reasons.
So what are some of the less obvious ones?
Yeah, I think that maybe one of the less obvious ones for some people is actually the litigation risk. I think when we talk about compliance, people think about, regulatory kind of compliance and fines or investigations, and there's all of that. Increasingly, we're seeing more and more class actions related to employment laws and employment law compliance, which can be extremely costly. And then even less obviously is the reputational risk and the reputation that employers want to be mindful of. I think as everyone in HR is well aware of right now, we're sort of going through the great resignation, as it's being called, and there are real issues across the board, retaining talent. And I think, it's an issue for everybody. It's particularly been heightened in the nonprofit sector, if I could talk about that.
Sure.
Yeah, so in years gone by, nonprofits often attracted talent because of their mission. And that's been changing a bit. So more recently, many for-profit employers are realizing this. They're offering more programs around things like volunteer work. We'll let you do some pro bono work. And that has really impacted the nonprofit sector's ability to attract and retain talent. Because now those employees are able to get both, the better salary and benefits that come in the for-profit world. The ability to do good work, things that are meaningful to them. And so for the nonprofits, it's really become even more important to ensure that they can compete on reputation as an employer, an employer that cares about their employees. And number one, that means making sure that they are in compliance with their employment law obligations.
Okay, so focusing on some areas of compliance that would impact HR. You discussed the categories right out of the gate, but what are some emerging issues? And I know this could get to be a very big question, so maybe pick.
Yeah, I think there's a couple. We probably can sort of focus it down to just a couple of key areas. Yeah. One area we're seeing a lot of change across the country is in health and safety.
Okay.
So, for example, Alberta recently completely rewrote its Occupational Health and Safety Act and the code. Those changes, for any of your listeners with employees in Alberta, those are all going to come into effect December 1 of this year.
Right.
Tied in with that health and safety theme, Quebec has also made a number of significant changes to their health and safety legislation. They've also introduced legislation to extend pregnancy and parental leave to surrogacy births, among other changes. So there's some interesting stuff kind of going on across the province or across the country.
Yeah.
I think we are also going to see a number of changes that are coming out of, COVID-19 and the greater move to remote work.
Okay.
I can give you one example that I think an example that's absolutely brand new that we're seeing here in Ontario. So on October 27th, the Ontario government introduced legislation that will require employers with 25 or more employees to have what they're calling a disconnecting from work policy. So disconnecting from work means, not engaging in work-related communications, including emails, telephone calls, video calls, or the sending or reviewing of other messages. And this appears to be completely in response to remote work. And the issue that comes from people, essentially, when you're working from home, being, almost on 24/7.
So can we talk about the US a bit, just a little bit? How is the US similar or dissimilar to Canada?
And can't profess to be an expert in US compliance or employment laws, but there are some important differences. So I think one of the most significant differences is that in Canada, it is provincial legislation that applies to most employees. So it's really only a small percentage of employees in Canada that will come under federal legislation.
Right.
The difference is in the US, a lot of the employment legislation is federal. Okay. So that means it's the same laws that apply to employees across the United States.
Okay.
This is a big issue, for Canadian employers, because it means if you're an employer that has employees in more than one province, you've got to be on top of legislation from multiple jurisdictions. There isn't just one place to go to say, this is what applies. This is, my employee's entitlement to a pregnancy leave, for example.
Right.
It's going to vary from one province to another, and what applies to you depends on the location of those employees. I can just say too, generally speaking, there are just more compliance requirements in Canada. We do have more obligations overall than there are in the US.
Right. Yeah. If you found this helpful, click like or subscribe. And the question for today is, what do you find difficult about compliance? Let us know in the comment section below. Let's talk a bit more tactically. So let's say you're the HR person and you've been asked a compliance type question. It's not in your policies. And even if it is, you should probably be checking. How would you go about that?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think it's really important to understand that there are a number of things that you have to think through. It's not, it's sort of a multi-step process.
Okay, so what are the steps?
So first, you've got to think about all of the various legislation that might apply. So for example, let's say the issue you're looking at is something related to violence and harassment.
Right.
Those requirements are dealt with in different legislation in different provinces. And there could be more than one act that applies. So you'll find those in health and safety, employment standards, or human rights legislation. And every province, it's a little bit of a different mix. It may just be in one, it may be in, two of those, and it may be in different one or the other than in another province. The other thing is, when you're thinking about what legislation applies, In some cases, there might be totally unrelated legislation that applies. So I can give you another example. If you're a federal employer, the section that says you can give an electronic pay stub is found under a privacy law regulation. It's not even in the employment standards stuff. The next thing you have to do is consider all of the section of the Act and the regulations that might apply. So the way our legislation generally works, the Act will set out many obligations, but the details are often found in the regulation. So you've got to check both. You may look and say, look, here's these sections of the Act. They seem to set out what I need to do. If you don't look to the regulation, you could miss a whole bunch of other obligations that you have.
Are you safer just to look in the regulation and not look in the Act, or do you have to do both?
You have to do both.
Oh,
yes.
Okay.
So the place to start is the Act, because that'll set out generally your general kind of obligation. So you would look to, for example, the Employment Standards Act in a province and look at what the issue is you might be looking for. You can't assume, though, that is all there is to it. You need to then look to the regulations.
Okay.
Similarly, you shouldn't just start with a regulation. Almost anything that's in a regulation, there's something connecting it in an Act as well. Like the obligation comes somewhere from the Act. So you really have to look at both.
Okay. This sounds like an exceptionally time-consuming process. Is there some way to do it fast and efficiently besides your software?
Besides our software, I hate to say it, but no, not if you want to be sure that you're not missing things. That is why we started Compliance Works. This is exactly the problem that we set out to solve, because there isn't another way. If you want to be sure that you've really kind of got everything, this is what you need to do. The reality is, if you're a larger employer and you go to a law firm, that is one way, I guess. It's going to be really expensive, but you can hire a lawyer and say, look, I need to know, what my obligations are. And a lot will do that. They'll go to a law firm that'll prepare a large chart for you that will sort of set all of this out. This is the steps, though, that they will go through. Often you'll find that things aren't all nice and neatly packaged together with everything you need to know, in one section or even in a couple of successive sections. You've got to look at, there might be definitions that impact. There might be you could be looking throughout an entire Act to make sure you've got everything that applies. And then just sort of lastly, you've got to look and make sure that there aren't any either exemptions or special rules that apply. So especially with employment standards, there are a lot of special rules depending on the industry you're in, the type of employee, like if you're a manager or, so you got to check all those too.
So what happens if I make a mistake and I say, so-and-so, you get 7 days off or whatever, and really they're supposed to be getting 14 days or 5. How do you rectify that?
So it does depend on what the error is. So I would say, errors can generally be fixed, but it just does depend. So that example you just gave, if you've not been giving somebody the right amount of time off, you fix that financially. You're going to have to pay them for what they've lost.
Yes.
What I'd say generally is, the key is to fix the error as quickly as you can. Right. Don't stay non-compliant. It sort of ties into what the risks are. So, on something like that, there's a risk that you're going to end up under an investigation. If that employee goes to an employment standards officer and says, hey, I'm not getting the right amount of, time off, or, didn't get the right vacation, then you potentially trigger an investigation. Employees, in some cases may be able to actually sue you for that, which is not something you want because that becomes public.
So what is the one or two things that people just don't seem to get about compliance?
So I think one thing that people really don't realize is how often these laws change. So it can be easy to think you've dealt with these issues enough, you know what your obligations are. Like, I've been doing this, I understand it. Those obligations change a lot. So I can tell you, at Compliance Works, we cover over 110 acts and 232 regulations across Canada. that all just deal with HR compliance. So like that's a lot of law.
Yes, it is.
Yeah. Right now, as of today, there are 33 bills that are proposing changes to those laws.
Right.
And in the last year alone, forget about COVID. COVID changed every day. There were over 300 changes to employment laws in Canada. I know from HR professionals that we speak with, that shocks them. And it's a little bit scary because with that is the realization that for sure there are things that you think you know that are now wrong.
Right.
Yeah.
It is scary. I'll vouch for HR professionals. It's scary. So what are some ways to stay abreast of compliance changes? And I mean, talk about your software, but maybe talk about some other stuff as well.
As you said, that is the problem that we've tackled at Compliance Works. The reality is, absent a tool like ours, and I think it's fair to say I don't think there isn't anything really comparable right now. The reality is there hasn't been a great way to stay on top of these changes. So generally, what you can do is, you rely on media reports of changes, right? Subscribe to updates from law firms. So you'll get emails with client updates that can be helpful. Often communications from, either professional or industry associations. So, the HRPA in Ontario or CPHR, or oftentimes payroll associations, they'll provide, some updates as well. Mm-hmm. The only thing I'd caution people with those, if that is kind of the method you're using, is that these are all a bit haphazard. So they don't cover every change. You're not getting, a communication about every change, and they're often not very timely. So knowing that something's coming is helpful. And a lot of times the way those communications are done, it's just a bit ad hoc, right? They aren't those they're not in the business, to put it this way, of providing you that. It's sort of a service that all of these organizations offer, but it's a bit haphazard. And the other thing is, you got to keep track of those, right? So you got to make sure you're saving those emails and you're kind of monitoring that in a way.
Right.
Larger organizations often do have, and I'm talking really large organizations, an HR professional who is actually allotted this responsibility. It is their job to monitor these changes by actually checking the government websites, and looking for those updates. It's hugely time consuming. And I, fully admit, not really an option if you're a smaller organization. There's research out of the US, there isn't any in Canada, but data out of the US says that, HR compliance takes about 23 to 36 hours per week. The other thing I would say is, certainly what our tool does, we report on all changes that affect HR compliance. We report on those generally within 48 hours and often less. So we have our own proprietary software that tracks all government sites. We get notice as soon as they are posted, essentially, and we turn that around to you, again, like I said, often the night that it's released, always within 48 hours. You can also, just like the other types of communications I was talking about, so law firms and all of that, we post some information on our website and on our social media. So, I'm happy to have people, check out the website and check out our resources there to help them with this as well.
Right. Okay. Well, I will add links to those in the description of the episode. I think those will be all very useful. Thanks, Gayle. That was a very necessary conversation. I did an episode on employee manuals, which often need to be updated related to compliance, and that link is right here. Thanks for watching and see you next time.